Hello and welcome to Ivory Blush Roses. My name is Lisa and today I'm getting started on the preparation for our sampler project. When I started thinking about this project, I was actually thinking about doing an embroidered sampler similar to the Rick Rack sampler. It's a little harder to film that because it's long and narrow. And secondly, I can't do anything with it when I'm done. And I would actually really... Mushu! Kitty interlude. I've had lots of different ideas for a long-term project, but I realized that in the end, I want to make something that I can hang on the wall and enjoy. Many of you have also mentioned that you would like to see me stitching on crazy quilt blocks. And so I decided to make small 4-inch blocks to create a wall hanging that will be 6 blocks wide and 7 blocks high. There are lots of ways these blocks could be assembled if you don't want to do a wall hanging. You could sew 4 blocks together to make an 8-inch page for a book. That would result in probably 10 to 11 pages. The blocks could also be assembled end to end in a long length and then rolled up as a scroll. And if you don't want to stitch on a crazy quilt square, there's not a reason that you couldn't just choose a square of fabric, put some lines across it, and just stitch on the lines. Let's take a look at how I came up with the blocks that I'm using. First, I made some patterns. I find when I'm making a lot of blocks, this helps speed the process up. And we're going to be making 42 blocks. Let me show you how I make a pattern for a block. For this 4-inch block, I've just used my 4-inch quilt square, and I've put it on my paper and traced around it. Most of our blocks for this sampler, we want 5 seams. On a small 4-inch block like this, however many sides that center block has, that's how many seams we're going to have on that piece. My goal in these blocks, I want the length of each seam to be similar in length. Now, I don't want a perfect, what do you call a 5-sided piece? I don't remember now. I don't want one that all the sides are exactly even to it. You want it to have some movement to it. I'm going to start by drawing something in the center. I don't want it parallel to the outer lines. I'm thinking odd angles. And how about something like that? Now I might look at that and say, oh, I need to shift that over a little bit so it's more in the center, and that's fine. I'll just erase the lines that I don't want. And then I'm going to come in with my template and I'm going to think about where do I want to put my first seam. And I usually like to choose the biggest one. So let's say that's this one here. And I'm going to choose that one and I'm going to go off. Because that first seam often can end up with a much smaller piece. And I don't want a smaller piece. Now, one of the things that I've learned when I've been doing this is that I tend to piece counterclockwise. And so I want to pay attention to that as I'm going. There's my first one. There's my second one. And you're going to see that with this, we've really got a lot of leeway here. And so with the ruler here, I can adjust and make those lines nice and straight. And if I think a piece is looking a little too big or too small, I can adjust it. So let's take this one and go off that way. I also don't want it to end right at the corner, so I definitely want it to come in, and I'm pretty happy with that. This is one where if we start here, we're going to come and put this piece down first and sew that seam right there. Then we're going to put this one on and we're going to stitch all of this here. Then we're going to put the third one on here and we'll stitch that whole seam down. And then that one's going to be the fourth one. And this will be the fifth one. We're just going to call this block number 1. I'm pretty happy with that. The seams are all a nice length. They don't crowd one another, and that works pretty well. And it's a little bit irregular, which I really like. The one thing that's going to happen over here is that if I continue this seam all the way down, you can see how small that piece would be. So this piece, when I stitch this one on, I'm going to leave it folded back. And we're going to stitch that piece, and then we'll trim off somewhere back in here. And then we're going to flip that piece back over and stitch it down. And you can just baste that lightly down or pin it to be truthful, and that will do the job. If I'm thinking I want to use one of these without doing that, I'm going to choose my biggest side. So let's do this one. That's my biggest side on here, and we would put that piece on and sew it down. And then the next piece we're going to sew on here. There's the second one. Let's put on, that'd be the third one. And then I'm going to play with this one a little bit because I don't want it to come here. So I'm going to tip that a little bit here. And there's our fourth one. And then our fifth one is actually going to end up coming all the way across the block. And that would be 5. Now that ends up with one really long seam, one shorter seam, and then 3 that are somewhat comparable. I'm not as fond of that, so truthfully, my preference is to go ahead and do that flip and sew piecing. But if you don't want to do that, because then you see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is actually ends up our shortest seam. They're all much more even, and I like the look of the block better, but it is a little bit more work when you have to fold back that piece, stitch this down, and then lay it back over. Tiny bit more work, but just a little bit of difference. And I would call that one block 2. The next step on this is to take that pattern. I usually make 2 copies. I never use the one that I've drawn to cut up or use as templates when I'm piecing the block. I also am going to put on here, this is a 5 seam block. That helps me know when I'm piecing which one I'm going to use. So I have 6 patterns now that have 5 seams on them. So here's my other patterns. I'm going to make 30 blocks, so probably 5 of each one. I did 4 designs of 4 seams, but I think we're going to cut that down to 2. I really like this one with sort of this kite seam. These I'm not as fond of. I kind of like this one. So I think we're going to do those 2. Then I have the 6 seam one. These, we could go with any of those. I sort of like this one. It's a little bit irregular. It's probably my least favorite just because this piece is much smaller, but the seams are much more even in length. I may make 1 or 2 of each of those to have, and then I can just pick and choose from them. So I may do a couple of extra blocks, but I'm probably only going to do 6 of these 4 seam blocks, and we'll call that good. So that's how I created the pattern. Let me know in the comments below if you would like me to make a PDF pattern available to purchase for the different blocks that I'm using. I cut a whole stack of my foundation blocks from scraps of muslin and white cotton that I had saved from other projects. Because I'm going to be attaching my blocks to a 7-inch frame to facilitate filming, I cut my muslin or cotton squares to 7 inches so that it would fit on the frame. If you're going to use a hoop, I would probably put that foundation fabric just a little bit bigger so that you can accommodate a 6-inch hoop. This is the palette of fabric that I'm going to be using. At first I was going to do it all in cream, but I actually woke up 2 nights in a row dreaming about this project and thinking it needed some pink in it. I ended up with an assortment of 15 different fabrics, including the 3 pink focus fabrics that I wanted to use for the centers. After I had sewn several blocks, I chose the threads I'm going to use on this project. I don't want these to have too high of a contrast, and I don't want them to blend in either. So I stuck mostly with threads in the middle values on a light to dark scale, and I found it very helpful to lay a thread out across the block so I could see how it would really work. Did it have too much contrast? Did it show up well enough? Or did I maybe need to leave it out? I included both pearl cottons as well as stranded embroidery floss in my threads. And my hope is to use a real mix of these across the entire piece. And I also included a few variegated threads. I just love how they can change the look of a seam, and so it's fun to include some of those as well. At this point, now with all the materials gathered, I'm really ready to start sewing my blocks in earnest. What I discovered when I was piecing is that on one copy that you make, you're just going to cut out the center sections. So now I have each of my centers cut. Once you cut this out, you're going to be piecing to the edges. Because they're flip and sew piecing, I don't really need to cut the other pieces. I just need to know which order I'm sewing around them. And then I use those to cut the fabric centers from the pink fabrics that I had chosen. And then I take my second copy and I cut out the whole block and I put it underneath the muslin. When I cut my fabric out, I want a 1/4 inch seam on that, and I'm going to place it in location. And once I have it in location, then as I piece from there, I know that I'm going to be good. So I'm ready on this block to put on the second piece. And this is where I'm going to pull out my master copy and make sure I know which one is going to be this first piece and the second piece. So I'm going to put the first piece here and the second piece here. So I'm working clockwise on this one if I want to match what I've drawn out. It's nice to have that as I go. Now over here to my right, I have my stack of fabrics that I'm going to be using. And I've just been trying to balance the fabrics. Let me pull out a block and I'll show you. I know I want pink in every block. So I actually cut out my center pieces all at the same time. I just stacked the fabric, put my pattern piece on and trim around it, and then I'm good to go. I'm trying to vary the fabrics that I'm using. Here's a good example. I've got some lighter ones. They read whiter, like these two. They're not really white, but they're the lightest fabrics. And then I have some darker ones. And then I have some that have some pattern to it, and I have a couple of batiks. And between those, I've got enough fabrics that I can really get a nice variety. I just try and alternate them around. And on some of these, like this one, doesn't read as pink, and so I don't hesitate to use a little bit of that pink fabric to help with that. I think about what do I want for a bigger piece, and I like the light here. Most of my pieces are fat 8ths or fat 1/4s. I don't worry about staying with the grain. I'm just going to line up that fabric with that seam. I want a little bit of overlap on the ends, and I'm going to pick that up, put that over here at the machine. I'm just going to stitch down that seam. I don't need to fix my seam. In fact, I want to be able to pull it apart if I need to, and when I put the next piece of fabric on, that will help hold it in place. And I just trim my threads. If I need to trim my seam, this would be when I do it. And I'm just going to fold that piece of fabric back. I wasn't paying attention, and do you see what I did? It's going to need to come down because this next seam is going to come this way and this one's going to come this way. So I didn't allow for that. I have my seam ripper handy. Remember to put the ball underneath. The point goes on top and you can just zip it right off. So I need to turn it over and see to get enough fabric here. And I want to make sure it got enough to cover. And I'm trying to come out to about the 1/2 or 3/4 inch mark on here. So I'm going to line it up right about there. And then bring it over the machine and we'll stitch it again. And I don't worry about if I go a little bit past the ends of the piece. It's not going to hurt at all. All right, let's try this one again. So I'm going to turn it over, and that's much better. Now you can see that I've got lots of room. I'm going to press that seam open. I'm going to press it all the way to the edge of my block because now the next thing is I need to trim. I am going to trim from this line straight down. That's going to be my next piece. And then I'm going to trim along the edge of my block, and I've got enough contrast there I can see that. And this one we're going to trim straight down that way and trim that again about 1/2 inch in from the edge of the block, give or take. These blocks, they can really go oriented any direction. I'm going to give it just one more quick press, and now I can already see with this where I'm going next. So this is a pretty light one. I need something a little bit darker. So that could be a good place to use a batik. And a lot of times I just play with it. I've got some of this patterned fabric. I could use something like that as well. I really like that, but I don't want the block to get too light. So sometimes as I do this, I just have to play with it and see what's going to be the better balance of fabrics. Would it be better to have something like that? There's a lot of leeway with this, and obviously some of this has gotten kind of rough. It needs trimmed up, and that's too close in color to that. But we have this one, and that might be good. So that sort of pulls through the light from over here, and then we could use this batik coming up that way, and I think that's a good balance. I think that's the order we're going to do. So I'm just going to set those down in my lap. I don't worry too much about direction on these because I'm probably going to be rotating them as I go. I'm just going to lay it over. We know from having had it the other direction, I'm in good space. And trim those threads. So I'm going to iron that. On this one, I'm just going to trim straight up the edge of my block. And I think we'll trim straight up this way. Now, this piece looks really big on here right now, but remember, we're actually only doing a 4-inch block, but we're making almost a 6-inch block here to start with. We decided we were going to do this batik here because I'm going to stitch this way, just thinking about which direction I'm going into the sewing machine. I'd rather have that bulk on the outside than on the inside. Now, one of the other things that I did, and I realize I'm not even thinking about doing it, is I've overlapped here so that I'm stitching all the way over the edge of that piece. Now I'm just going to fold it over. And we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to use that center piece as my guide, and I'm just going to trim straight up to there, and then I'm going to trim off about, I don't know, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the block. We're done with that fabric on this one. I always feel like it's good to give it another press. I think it just helps to get it nice and tight. And then we're going to use this one, and this is going to be a piece that goes there. So I think we're just going to go this direction. Yeah, I can do that. That angle goes off at the correct angle. But again, I'm leaving that overlap here, and I'm going to stitch from here down. I do a real mix usually of both hand and machine piecing, but on this particular project we have 42 blocks to make. And so for me it's just a little easier if I do this on the machine. I'm a little faster. If I'm doing something that has any curves in it, I usually do those by hand. And we're going to fold that out. And I find by not pre-cutting my pieces, I have less fabric waste. And then we have one last piece of fabric, and we're going to use this batik for that. I've got a good straight edge there. Let's use that. I think that one's big enough. And so even though my pieces kind of curve a little bit, I'm lining up to that center piece. And then I'm going to stitch right along the edge of this, and I'll need to trim this seam when I'm done. So just kind of grab it all together, bring it to the machine, and just stitching straight down that edge. Let me trim this here. We're just going to trim that even with that batik piece. Make sure you're not cutting your backing fabric. Now I can fold that over. I'm going to trim up. And this does not have to be exact. Our block is going to be significantly smaller than this. So there we have our pieced block. The first few that I did took me a long time. As I'm doing more of them, it's taking me a lot less time. Now I'm going to take my 4-inch template. This is where I really like having the clear ones because I can see where my center block is, and I can balance making sure that each of these other pieces has a good bit showing, because I want that seam. We're doing a sampler. We're going to be trying out stitches. I want enough length to be able to show the stitch that we're doing. And so I can just play with it until I think I'm where I want to be. And each of the blocks will have a little bit of variation. With the pen, I'm using the blue water removable pen. And I want that because I don't want it to come undone. I want to be able to see where it is. This line is already outside of my 4-inch block. Now I'm going to baste just outside of that line. And the basting will end up almost 1/8 of an inch away from where the finished block size is. So once we put them together, hopefully it won't even show. So I'm just going to baste just outside that blue line. I'm going to do that all the way around. And now I'm going to actually go and stitch around it one more time. This time I'm going to use the edge of my presser foot and run that right along that blue line, right around 1/4 foot away from the previous line of stitching. Just helps make sure that my fabrics all stay nice and stable. I don't know how necessary it is, but it's just something I have always done and like to do. And again, I'm not finishing these off. This is just basting stitches. I'm going to trim my threads again. And now I'm going to give it a press from the outside and from the front side. And that block is finished and ready to go. Here's a 6-sided one that I want to leave an open end on. Let's go ahead and do one of those. So let me grab a muslin square. I just give it a quick press. If it's really wrinkly, I'll give it a little spray with some distilled water, and that looks pretty good. I center the block on my piece of muslin. I'm going to put that right there. The first one I want to put on is actually this one up here. Now this one can use a little extra pink, and I have this that's a pretty pale pink, but I think that piece might go really well there, so let's do that. I need that to go all the way out here to the edge. We're going to bring it back like so. The first thing I'm going to do before I go too far here is we're going to trim this off here. And I'm just going to do that to start with. And now before I iron that down, I want to fold that edge. I want this to fold straight all the way. And I'm just going to press that seam, and then I can trim the rest of it off. Now I know where all those fabrics are, and I don't want that quite all the way out. Now this piece we're going to actually be pulling back, and I'm just popping those 2 stitches because when we put this piece in, this one is going to lay over it, but we're going to actually be going this direction, and that's going to be the last piece that we bring in. So we have one piece left to go, and this is the one we're going to be folding this back and lining it up here, so it needs to come out to here, and then this piece will fold back out over it. I like that one, so let's use that. And I'm going to put it this direction, but I need to fold that back because we need to stitch over that. And so I'm going to pick that up, bring it to the machine. Okay, well I think I missed part of that, and I'm not sure where the camera stopped off. My apologies for that. So I've got my block flat, and I just had folded that back. I popped a stitch to make sure that I had room. I'm going to iron that open. I'm going to trim this up before I do anything else because it's a little unwieldy for me. I can see the edge of my block right underneath here, so I'm just eyeballing what I think is roughly 1/2 inch. And then I don't want to come down from here, but I want to come down from that inner edge. And so we're just going to come down like that and make those lines intersect. And then let's do this with that one over the top. There we go. And so this is loose, and that's fine. We don't need to do anything with that right now. I'm going to get my template, my blue pen. There's my line. Let me run a quick basting around it. And there's our block. And it looks good from all directions. I'm going to be taking these and putting them on the frame. I've got a nice taut surface. I really like the mini bars for these small blocks. When you order them, you get one package of 2 if you order a single one. I'll put the affiliate link in the description box below for all of these products. I actually bought a set of 4 pairs, and so I'll be able to have 2 of these set up and ready to go. Here's our blue line where we're stitching. So there's my stitching line. I've got a good inch of space around most of the block. And so that's really nice. I've got a lot of room to work, and that makes it much easier. That is how to sew the blocks together. Now, I do know this is a lot of blocks. We're looking for a total of 42 blocks. For myself, I find it a lot easier if I stitch them all in a pretty similar time frame. I'll just show you what I have. I've gone for light colors because it's going to be easier for you to see the stitches. So I've still got quite a few more to go. I'm just going to work on that through the course of the coming week, and then I'll have them all done. I have a basket that I'm keeping them in, and I'll just have them all stacked up nice and neat in my basket. If you decide you're going to piece them as you go, keep your fabric and your patterns together and don't take it out for anything else. And I'm telling you that from personal experience because it's really easy to start off and think, oh, you know exactly which fabrics you used. 10 months from now, you may not remember which fabrics you used. I actually cut all of my centerpieces ahead of time. That way I have no doubt what is the centers of my block. I have 15 fabrics, and that's actually been a really nice amount because my blocks are random and yet they all coordinate. And like I said, I just have been alternating kind of light and dark as I go around the outside, and that has worked really well for me so far. Get your blocks ready. Happy piecing! Thank you so much for being here today and following along as I set up this sampler project. Thank you so much for watching. Happy stitching, and I will see you in the next video.